Our story today looks at the last night, the final Passover, before Jesus' crucifixion. All four of the Gospels, the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, recount this story, and we'll be pulling from all four accounts to gain a richer and more full picture of the events of this narrative. Let's begin reading from Mark 14. Now the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread were only 2 days away, and the chief priests and the teachers of the law were scheming to arrest Jesus secretly and kill him. But not during the festival, they said, or the people may riot. And Judas went to the chief priests and the officers of the temple guard and discussed with them how he might betray Jesus. They were delighted and agreed to give him money. He consented and watched for an opportunity to hand Jesus over to them when no crowd was present. So here we have the context for our story. The religious leaders are looking for a way to get rid of Jesus. Matthew 26 adds some detail to this exchange, as we're told that the chief priests and the elders of the people assembled in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and they schemed to arrest Jesus secretly and kill him. During this meeting in the palace of Caiaphas, how to get rid of Jesus is the topic of the day. But they don't yet know how to proceed with this because, as it says in Luke, they were afraid of the people. Why would this come into play? Well, Jesus had immense popularity among many of the people in Judah, known for his help and healing, and many believed him to be the promised Messiah. And so the religious leaders worried that if they made a move on him, the people might riot. Now this meeting about getting rid of Jesus is taking place only 2 days before Passover begins. Passover and the festival of unleavened bread was the festival and holy time observed by all the Jews. Passover began the 7-day festival and was a memorial to when God delivered the Israelites from their slavery in Egypt. Passover was a huge event in Judah in the days of Jesus. Jews from all over, not only Judah, but the world, would travel to Jerusalem, where the temple was. Staying in and around the city, they would celebrate the feast and bring sacrificial animals to the temple for the priests to sacrifice for their sins. Jerusalem was already a busy hub, but during the festival, imagine all those people streaming in to celebrate Passover. There'd be even larger crowds than usual, posing an even greater threat if the people were to react negatively to the religious leaders' actions. Hence, they conclude, but not during the festival. But as we read, a seeming solution has presented itself to the elders and priests in the form of a man named Judas. He approaches them, offering to betray Jesus, granting them the possibility of perhaps arresting him quietly without the crowds around. Many of us may be familiar with who Judas was, but just to make sure we're on the same page, Jesus had many followers, but he had 12 specific disciples, often called apostles, whom he called to follow him full-time. The man called Judas Iscariot was one of these 12, one of the 12 apostles or disciples of Jesus. Judas has spent the past 3 years following Jesus as his rabbi. The 12 disciples would live, eat, travel with Jesus, learn from Jesus, and so Judas, of course, has a unique knowledge of his master's whereabouts and times that may be easier to capture him. In short, Judas is now seen as the secret door to seizing Jesus. And Luke writes he watched for an opportunity to hand Jesus over to them when no crowd was present. Let us continue reading Matthew 26, verse 1. Jesus said to his disciples, "As you know, the Passover is 2 days away, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified." Then came the day of unleavened bread on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, "Go and make preparations for us to eat the Passover." They left and found things just as Jesus had said, so they prepared the Passover. So Jesus, with his disciples, have too traveled to Jerusalem to celebrate the festival. They have rented the upstairs guest room of a house of someone living in the city. And on this day, the first day of the Passover week, the Passover Seder, or meal, will be shared. The evening meal was in progress. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. And Jesus says, "Those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean. And you are clean, though not every one of you." For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said not every one was clean. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. "Do you understand what I have done for you?" he asked them. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. I am not referring to all of you, I know those I have chosen, but this is to fulfill this passage of Scripture. He who shared my bread has turned against me. I am telling you now before it happens, so that when it does happen, you will believe that I am who I am." Jesus, in this striking act, washes his disciples' feet. Washing hands and feet before a meal was common custom in Judah. Firstly, people wore sandals, and so the grime and dust and dirt of the day's travel would be caked onto one's feet. They would be in need of a wash. Secondly, it was customary to recline around the table one was eating at, which would make washing your feet seem an even more seemly thing to do. The washing of your feet would typically be done by the servant in the household, and even when guests came over for a meal, upon serving, the servant would wash the guest's feet before food would be had. But now, Jesus is washing the disciples' feet, which would seem, in some sense, wrong and noticeable. He was their leader, their rabbi. He makes a point of this himself, saying, "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for this is what I am." But now their master is acting like a servant, kneeling down, washing their feet. And the discomfort of this blatant trespass on accepted hierarchy structures causes Peter to make this protest and say, "Jesus will never wash my feet." But Jesus uses this act of servanthood to illustrate the forgiveness and service he gives to his disciples, and how they in turn are asked to do the same for each other. Following the foot washing, Jesus sits back down. When the hour came, Jesus and his apostles reclined at the table, and he said to them, "I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I will not eat it again until it finds fulfillment in the kingdom of God." As Jesus and his disciples enact the ceremony of the Passover meal, Jesus uses its symbolism to offer a new covenant with his disciples, a relationship and the gift he is giving them. "And he took bread, gave thanks and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, 'This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you.'" After he had said this, Jesus was troubled in spirit and testified, "Very truly I tell you, one of you is going to betray me." His disciples stared at one another, at a loss to know which of them he meant. And it says in Matthew, they were very sad and began to say to him one after the other, "Surely you don't mean me, Lord?" John continues, "One of them, the disciple whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. Simon Peter motioned to this disciple and said, 'Ask him which one he means.' Leaning back against Jesus, he asked him, 'Lord, who is it?' Jesus answered, 'It is the one whom I will give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish.' Then, dipping the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. So Jesus told him, 'What you are about to do, do quickly.' But no one at the meal understood why Jesus said this to him. Since Judas had charge of the money, some thought Jesus was telling him to buy what was needed for the festival, or to give something to the poor. As soon as Judas had taken the bread, he went out, and it was night. When the meal ended, Jesus and his disciples walk over towards a place called the Mount of Olives. This was part of a mountain range that separates Jerusalem from the Judean desert, and on it grew many olive trees. As they walk into the night, Jesus has a conversation with his disciples. He comforts them about the future and what is about to happen to him. They arrive finally at a place called the Garden of Gethsemane, a garden located at the base of the Mount of Olives. And here Jesus goes off on his own to pray. Then he returned to the disciples and said to them, "Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." While he was still speaking, a crowd came up, and the man who was called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place, because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. "The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him." Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. And in Luke it says, "But Jesus asked him, 'Judas, do you betray the Son of Man with a kiss?'" Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said. And Judas the traitor was standing there with them. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they said. Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. If you are looking for me, then let these men go." Then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Later that day, Jesus would be sentenced to death and executed on a cross. Now, the story of the betrayal of Jesus is one which has been told many times. Reference to it has been made within and without religious circles, to the point that even today, Judas is a name immediately associated with betrayal. Judas is a long-standing idiom for stabbing someone in the back, and a Judas kiss, a term to describe a treacherous act disguised as affection or friendliness. But there are some truly remarkable and important details which are often overlooked in the telling of this narrative, and today we're going to be exploring these. Firstly, let us look at Judas' decision to betray Jesus. It is clear that his choice was premeditated. Not only did he take the initiative to approach the religious leaders, but Matthew 26 tells us that he was looking to earn something from the exchange. Verse 15, "Then one of the 12, the one called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and asked, 'What are you willing to give me if I hand him over to you?' And they set out for him 30 pieces of silver." Now, 30 pieces of silver in those days was not a lot of money. It was a really small sum, which can perhaps tell us something about how much the religious leaders valued Jesus' life. But this amount, 30 pieces of silver, did carry a common significance, namely that it was the price of a slave in a certain context. 30 pieces of silver was the amount required for a person to pay a master if a slave was gored by a bull, as Exodus 21:32 tells us. If the bull gores a male or female slave or servant, the owner must pay 30 shekels of silver to the master of the slave. In other words, the price marked upon Jesus' life was the same as a slave's life. This number, 30 pieces, hailed back all the way to the days of the book of Exodus. This is how much the Pharisees and the priests value Jesus' life, and this is the price Judas accepts for Jesus' life. Such a small amount, bought so cheaply, treated as a slave. The second detail worth noting in this story is the sad nature of the source of betrayal. An unknown author wrote, "The saddest thing about betrayal is that it never comes from your enemies, it comes from those you trust the most." And this sadness and heartbreak is expressed by Jesus too, as Judas moves to kiss him, as though a friend is greeting another friend. "Judas, do you betray the Son of Man with a kiss?" But the third detail is how clearly and often it is stated in the text that Jesus is fully aware of Judas' treachery. And not just as a recent discovery, Jesus talks about it all the way back in John chapter 6. "But there are some of you who do not believe." For Jesus knew from the beginning who they were who did not believe, and who it was that would betray him. Jesus has stated it outright, before Passover, before that Passover meal. This isn't your typical betrayal. A betrayal usually brings a terrible shock. It surprises you. It sneaks up on you from behind, the source being someone you don't expect it from. But here, all along, Jesus knows exactly who is going to betray him, and even how. So Jesus told him, "What you are about to do quickly." And this realization of Jesus knowing leads us to a shocking discovery about the other events which took place that final evening together on that Passover night. If we think back now to what we've already read happened in that upper room, Jesus washes his disciples' feet. Jesus shares in the Passover meal with his disciples. Jesus offers his disciples the gift of a new covenant relationship with God. Jesus offers his disciples the gift of his very life, his body, his blood. And who is there for all of this? Judas. It is a common misconception that Judas leaves before the night's foot washing, or that he leaves before Jesus offers the cup of the covenant and the bread representing his sacrifice, because that is not what the text says. First there is the foot washing, likely before the meal, and then during the meal Jesus breaks the bread and shares the wine with them. And then during this same meal, Judas dips his bread into the same plate as Jesus, revealing himself to be the traitor among them. But only after all this does Judas depart the upper room and go fetch the men who would later come and arrest Jesus. Judas was there. He had his feet washed by their master, the same as the rest. He was offered forgiveness and served by Jesus. He was extended the invitation to have a covenant with God. He is given the bread and wine, symbolizing Jesus' gift and commitment to them. Think about this for a second. Jesus knew all along what Judas had done, what Judas was about to do. Jesus knew, but Judas ate too. As the 12 were gathered around the table, Jesus invited them into a new kingdom, a new covenant, a relationship with God, where God commits to be faithful to them and his promises to them. Promises of restoration, forgiveness, hope, and all good things. Jesus seals his commitment to these promises and to his relationship with them later with his very life. And he extends this to all of them, including Judas. This tells us several profound things about the love Jesus has for each and every person. Number one, Jesus gives even to his enemies. Jesus' giving to Judas wasn't limited to that one night. Jesus had spent years investing in Judas. He had taught him, guided him, trusted him, hoped in him, given him responsibility, empowered, nurtured, prayed for, defended him. Judas was one of the chosen ones. And even while knowing that Judas would sell Jesus at the price of a slave to those who would torture and harm and kill him, he is holding his hand out to Judas until the very end. He feeds the very mouth that would deceive him. He washes his feet in service and forgiveness. He invites him and defends his free will even to choose such a vile betrayal. Number two, this story tells us that we don't get to police who comes to Jesus' table. The table where Jesus invites his followers, where he extends his promises to them, pledges his love to them, and offers salvation sealed with his very blood, is his table. He chooses, not us. If the other disciples had understood what Jesus was saying about Judas, and if they had their own way, Judas would likely not have escaped that room alive. This fact is illustrated by Peter's actions later in the Garden of Gethsemane, as he draws a sword and cuts off the ear of one of the men coming to seize Jesus. But Jesus made room for Judas as well. He opened the door to him, making room not only for Judas to change his mind, but to receive forgiveness. The way Jesus treats Judas the whole way through leaves no room for those who would assume the right to guard the door leading to Jesus. Those who think they may choose who gets to be saved, or who gets access to Jesus, or choose who gets a seat at the table belongs to Jesus. Thirdly, we are shown the contrast between Jesus and those who have plotted to kill him. They put such a small price on Jesus' head, valuing a man's life so cheaply. In contrast, Jesus is willing to fight so hard and pay such a high price for someone like Judas, to even have the chance to turn around and ask for help. We see this contrast further demonstrated in the story's continuation in Matthew 27. Early in the morning, all the chief priests and the elders of the people made their plans how to have Jesus executed. So they bound him, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate, the governor. When Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. "I have sinned," he said, "for I have betrayed innocent blood." "What is that to us?" they replied. "That's your responsibility." So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Let us take a moment here to notice the shocking response of the priests. The priests in the temple were there to guide the people of Judah to God. They served day and night in the temple to do this very thing, receive repentant people and offer sacrifices for their sins that they may be forgiven. That is their job description, their very purpose as priests. Now a man comes to them and says these words, "I have sinned. I have betrayed innocent blood." Judas is experiencing remorse. He is turning back from what he has done wrong. He's openly and honestly confessing to his sins. He is seeking forgiveness and to make things right. And what is the priest's response? "What is that to us? That's your responsibility." In other words, who cares? We don't care. That's your problem. And now compare their response with the response of Jesus. Jesus, who washed Judas' feet before he'd even done that horrible thing. Jesus, who dies forgiving his enemies. Jesus is the one who is going to go off and suffer. But that night he'd spend time comforting his disciples, knowing it would be a hard time for them. Jesus is the one going to die, and even as he's being arrested, he is still protecting and looking out for his disciples by saying, "If you are looking for me, then let these men go." Now here is a true high priest. Someone who advocates for others until his dying breath, saying, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And this leads us to the fourth and final point. Jesus chose Judas. The question arises, why did Jesus choose Judas? It is a struggle to comprehend. Joseph Parker expresses the answer to this question very well. Why did Jesus choose Judas? The greater mystery is, why did Jesus choose me? If we take a second look back at this story of Jesus' final Passover on earth, we begin to see that every single person sitting around that table was a traitor. They all betrayed Jesus. Jesus didn't only know of Judas' treachery or of Peter's denial, but of the treachery of all of them. Then Jesus told them, "Tonight you will all lose faith in me, as it is written, I will strike down the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered." As Jesus is arrested in the garden, Mark writes, "Then everyone deserted him and fled." And in Matthew, "Then all the disciples deserted him and fled." A young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. Mark's account describes one follower being so bent on not being arrested with Jesus that he's willing to escape without his clothes. It is easy to look at the disciples, to look at those gathered around that meal and say, these are the faithful and these are the traitors. But the truth is, every one of the disciples ended up betraying Jesus, each in their own way. There were 12 traitors, not just one sitting at that table, and he washed the feet of every one of them, and he extended the cup to every one of them, and he would go and die for every one of them. We are all traitors. We have all betrayed him. His goodness, who he is, what he stands for. Just like the disciples, even as we follow him, we fail over and over and over. We too have kissed our master as we betray him. We too have confidently said, as Peter did, "Even if all fall away on account of you, I never will." And next minute, he can't even stay awake for an hour with Jesus as he suffers. When looking honestly at this story, one concludes, I am Judas. But Jesus already knows. And it was for people like you and me that he came and continues to work to help. Just like Jesus knew from the beginning all about Judas and all about Peter and the rest of them, he still called them, still chose them, still loved them and helped them. So he pulls out a chair and still invites you and me to this table. There's a place saved for you. This is the beautiful and confounding reality of being around Jesus. The more you're there, the more you realize how little you deserve to be, and yet how resolutely and persistently you'll be accepted and welcomed and forgiven. We don't have to be afraid to approach, because Jesus already knows. He knows the state of our hearts. He knows our weaknesses, our history, our worst moments. He knows our failures. It's hard to fathom that kind of love. But let us remember that when it came to a traitor on that Passover, Jesus knew, but Judas ate too.